Hello, New Mexico, and welcome to another episode of Around the Roundhouse, a podcast featuring the policies, politics, and personalities of the land of enchantment. I'm your host, Daniel Chacón. Our guest this week is Clifford Rees, a retired state government attorney who served House Democrats during the 30-day legislative session earlier this year as a technical expert on a proposed constitutional amendment to provide lawmakers a salary, a question that will go before voters this November. Mr. Rees, who calls himself actively retired, has volunteered his time and expertise during the last 4 years to research and speak as a technical expert on the process to modernize the New Mexico legislature. During his career in state government, Mr. Rees worked for 4 different state agencies as an attorney, starting with what is now known as the Aging and Long-Term Services Department. But he spent the bulk of his career at the New Mexico Department of Health before retiring as general counsel of the New Mexico Department of Finance and Administration in 2005. Mr. Rees, welcome to Around the Roundhouse.
Great to be with you, Daniel.
It's great to see you in this format because I know that we would bump into each other occasionally at the Roundhouse. So it's great to see you in this format, but it's a little odd to not see you at the Roundhouse.
Yeah, I think of the Roundhouse during a legislative session as a cruise ship. You know, we depart on the first day of the session and we see each other everywhere in the lobby and the coffee shop. And then, of course, we reach port and return home when the session adjourns sine die, without days. And then we bump into each other every once in a while because we're both here in Santa Fe.
For sure, yes. But sometimes I feel like in those terms, I feel like Julie, the cruise director, because I'm kind of just bouncing around from floor to floor. But anyway, it's great to see you again, and thank you for joining us. We'll jump right in. Voters will consider a constitutional amendment. It's constitutional amendment number 4 this November. Exactly what are voters being asked to give a thumbs up or thumbs down to?
Right. So what we're talking about here is the compensation section of the New Mexico Constitution. And for those of you that have a copy like I do with me, it's Article 4, Section 10. You can read it yourself. So from the very beginning of New Mexico, even before it was a state, and by the way, the first Constitution was written in 1850, although the one we use now was written in 1910 and has been amended piecemeal since then. It only provided for legislators to receive per diem and mileage. And per diem, as you know, especially those of us that have worked in the public sector, it pays for out-of-pocket expenses, for meals and for lodging. Mileage the same way if we're asked to work away from our home. It's not salary. Now, people may say, well, Cliff, don't legislators receive a pension? And that is true. But the New Mexico Supreme Court has said in a decision they issued in 1995, that is not salary either. That's a fringe benefit, and legislators pay into that. And, you know, it's interesting, Daniel, I don't want to filibuster here, but when I hear people talk about the generous pension that legislators receive, when I was in state government, I had my pension contribution deducted from my paycheck. Legislators don't have a paycheck, so they write a personal check to the state to be able to participate in that pension plan. And yes, they do set how much it is because they're the money. Nobody else can do that. So what we're talking about is, for the very first time in our state's history, paying a salary for the part-time work that legislators perform all year round.
And Mr. Rees, does it just provide the path to provide lawmakers a salary, or will the salary be set in this question?
The specific amount will not be set. There have been proposals to do that in the past, to set a specific amount of salary. Of course, if you want to change that amount, you have to go back to the voters and amend the Constitution. Let's remember, constitutional amendments don't go to the governor. They go through the usual legislative process. A bill is introduced. It's either a House joint resolution or a Senate joint resolution. And it goes through the usual process that we see every day at the Roundhouse. It's referred to committees, it has hearings, it can be amended, goes to the floors. But if it passes both houses, it goes right to the voters, usually at the next general election. So we're going to see 4 constitutional amendments on our ballots in November. And number 4 will be this proposal to set salary. Specific to your question, the proposal doesn't set a specific amount. It has an outside entity determining how much the legislator's salary would be. This outside entity is based on the average New Mexico household income, the median income, and as typically determined by the US Census Bureau. So the legislators are not determining how much they're going to receive, and it doesn't apply until a little bit later. And we can talk about the delayed implementation and an interesting provision that will be in statute to follow, which is legislators who don't want to receive the salary. You quoted one of them in your article this past weekend. Excellent article, accurate, but maybe a little confusing. And we can talk about perhaps making sure voters understand the difference between staff salary and legislative salary.
And so, Mr. Rees, what the fiscal impact report on this constitutional amendment provided was that it calculated the amount at around $67,800. Is that where it would begin?
That's currently probably what it would be. But remember that median salary goes up and it goes down depending on how the economy is doing here in New Mexico. So we would start probably, if all things stay the same and this becomes a part of law and it's implemented. It would start, by the way, in January of 2029 for reasons I can explain that also have to do with our Constitution. And we're not exactly sure how much that will be. By the way, the average American household income is about 84,000. So it is way below the national median, but it is what currently is the New Mexico median average household income.
So, in short, voters will be asked to approve a compensation for lawmakers that would be set around the median household income.
Yes, and then there will be enabling legislation. Should this become law, if and when the voters approve this in November, it's kind of like having what we call an emergency clause on bills. It goes into effect immediately, but the details need to be enabled, added in legislation. And we have a roadmap for that. It was introduced during this last session in 2026, House Bill 102. And it lays out the roadmap, the delayed implementation, when it would become effective, how a legislator could opt out if they want to be a citizen legislator. I call this the traditionalists versus the modernists. And there are traditional legislators, and I don't mind naming names. Representative Lundstrom, whom you quoted in your article, certainly is one of those. And I hold nothing against her for wanting to decline if that's what she ultimately chooses to do, if she's in the legislature in January of 2029. But there are others, particularly the younger members, who really do need this to be able to serve. And that's the whole point of this, Daniel. Expand the universe of people who can afford to serve our legislature. Right now, we say you got to be one of the 3 R's, either rich, retired, or resourceful, to be able to afford to serve, because it's not just the 30 and 60-day sessions. Legislators, as you know, serve year round.
Mr. Rees, you brought this up earlier, and that is that lawmakers had voted to increase their legislative pensions by 27% in 2022 and another 50% in 2024. And folks have described that as very generous retirement benefits. But I wanted to ask, how would the proposed constitutional amendment affect retirement lawmakers' pensions? Would that
It would have no impact. I'm sorry, it would have no impact on the pension. It would have no impact on the current amounts of per diem and mileage that legislators received since the mid 1990s, which was the last time this provision of the Constitution was amended. Per diem and mileage, those out-of-pocket expenses, are set based on the Internal Revenue Service rate for the city of Santa Fe. It's kind of similar to what we the proponents are proposing for salary, that an outside expert entity would determine these amounts. The legislators wouldn't. Now, there really, as I said, there's really no way to calculate a pension when there's no salary. Usually pensions are based on some percentage of your salary. So the legislators themselves have to set that. And they're the only ones, of course, that can appropriate the money. In any case. So, out of necessity, legislators have to have some say in this, but this will not affect, this proposed legislation won't affect per diem, mileage, or pension. They can be increased or decreased as voted on.
Mr. Reese, after lawmakers voted to give themselves these higher retirement benefits and then brought on year-round legislative aids, many of whom received double-digit pay raises at the beginning of the year, as I reported in the story that you referenced earlier, is it going to be a tough sell for voters, especially when the enabling legislation will be left up to lawmakers?
Well, it's always been a tough sell historically in New Mexico. I've actually looked at the newspaper articles for the various constitutional amendment referendum between 1961 and 1994. Those were not successful, but I want to stress that those proposals were different. Each one was different. Some set up a independent commission to set the salary. Some wanted the non-existent at the time ethics commission to set the salary. Some just said as provided by law. Some proposals said this specific amount. So what this is doing is different. What you're going to vote on if you're a qualified voter in November is going to be different from anything that any New Mexico voters have seen. And then the pension can always be adjusted by statute. It's not constitutional. The per diem and mileage will continue to be a constitutional provision, and that would need to be adjusted by statute. So if part-time salary is authorized in November, yes, there's always room for adjustment of the other benefits that legislators receive for performing their legislative duties.
New Mexico, as you know, remains the only state in the nation with an unpaid legislature. And as you noted, there have been efforts in the past to provide lawmakers compensation. Why have those failed? They've just not been specific enough, or what's your take on that?
That's a great question, and that's why I want to look at the newspaper articles from the time to see what people were saying. Because as you know, we don't really have legislative history for our legislation. You mentioned the fiscal impact reports that are done by the highly regarded Legislative Finance Committee. That's pretty much all we have. And so people were saying a number of things. I call these the red herrings because they're often not related to what I think is the fundamental issue, which is, isn't it fair that legislators who work for the public should receive, if they choose, payment, some salary to allow them to serve? There's issues like, well, we've always had a citizen legislature, so we shouldn't change that, even though every other state, as you mentioned, has salary, and they seem to be functioning okay. And then there's a fear of having year-round, quote unquote, professional legislatures like New York or Massachusetts, California, and they do work year-round and they do receive significant salary, twice as much as what would probably be offered to our legislators. But we're not going to have a year-round legislature. We're too small a state to require that. But it does make sense to expand who could serve, to pay them at least a part-time salary, and those that don't want it can opt out.
Okay. One of the criticisms about the proposed constitutional amendment is it doesn't clearly define lawmakers' responsibilities, required hours, or a measurable workload. Would that be part of the enabling? Well, first of all, is that a fair criticism? And would that be part of the enabling legislation?
I don't think it's a fair criticism. We don't have a job description for legislators like we do for jobs in the executive branch and in the judicial branch. But we do know what legislators do because they do it mostly in public, and they work 30 and 60-day sessions. They meet pretty much monthly during the interim. And by the way, a topic for another discussion is there is a significant effort underway now to reform the interim, the process between the regular legislative sessions. And you'll be, I'm sure, reporting about that in the fall when the work group consisting of the four whips from the two houses, will be reporting back to the Legislative Council, which is sort of the board of directors
Mhm.
of the legislative staff, the year-round staff. So no, there's not going to be a job description. We know what the job description is, and it is in various parts of the Constitution, and it's in statute, and it's in legislative rules, all of which, to modernize the legislature, need to be looked at and probably updated as we continue this broader process of modernizing the legislature.
There was a recent video posted on Facebook by a lady by the name of Corinne Rios. She ran for a House seat in the Rio Rancho area in 2024. She was unsuccessful, but she, you know, uh, spoke about the constitutional amendment. And here's one of this a question that she asked, and I would love for you to be able to answer it for her. If there is enough work to justify a full-time aide handling correspondence, scheduling, research, constituent services, and town halls, don't voters deserve to know exactly what responsibilities remain for the legislator to perform personally?
Well, as I said, we know what the job description is for legislators. We know that they serve long hours during the 30 and 60-day
Mm,
sessions.
yes.
We know that they serve on interim committees. We know that, and this is where what are now called the district legislative aides come in. We legislators didn't have staff usually, and didn't have district staff. Especially difficult for those that are far from Santa Fe. We know we're the fifth largest state geographically. So the district, and one of the things you did not mention in my biography, which is rather extensive, is that I've served in a congressional office. I served in then Congressman Ben Ray Lujan's district office, and I did many of the things that these district legislative aides, who just were funded starting in 2024, we're really in the third year of having them. And that also is optional. Legislators don't need to hire a district legislative aide like Representative Lundstrom. And I'm not picking on her, I think she's a very fine legislator. I may not agree with her on all the issues, but she's elected and I'm not. Um, they didn't have, let me tell you a quick story, if I can. One of the representatives who has been behind this modernization process tells the story that she got a phone call from a constituent who had left a message a week before. Uh, this representative was able to return the call, and the constituent said, "How come your staff didn't return my call?"
All
And the
right.
representative said, "I am the staff." Now, she has hired a very fine district legislative aide, but we really could use the congressional model in terms of staffing and supporting our legislators so they can do, I think, what they really want to do, which is develop policy, develop legislation, go to town hall meetings, meet with their local elected officials. They do all of that, but then until they've gotten staff, they have had to do all of the returning the phone calls and reading the mail and the emails. Now they have some support. So that's really what we're talking about here. If I can, Daniel, I don't want to filibuster you here, but the political scientists talk about capacity to legislate, and they put it in three different categories. And the political scientists I'm talking about here are at UNM, really excellent political scientists who have been part of this. You probably know Professors Krebs and Rocca, and I'm not quoting them, but they say that to have a modern legislature with the capacity to legislate, we need to look at legislative salary. We need to look at the length of the session, which we haven't talked about, and we need to look at the staff support. And so that's really what those of us who are proponents of this modernization are doing. And we need to talk about how this will benefit the constituents. You talked about how this hasn't been terribly popular in the past. We, the proponents, need to make the case that the constituents will benefit from this, as well as the legislators who may not have before been able to afford to serve it. We don't know who's going to be elected. You know, we know there's good campaigners and not so good campaigners, and there's good elected officials and not so good. Who knows who will be able to run? Look, another quick story. I was on the floor with the Representative Christina Parajon, who was the House main sponsor for House Joint Resolution 5 this last session, as a technical expert. And I was sitting literally right in between the two youngest members of the legislature. Representative Parajon is the second youngest member, and they talked openly about this. And Representative Block, who you also quoted in your story, who sits right behind her. They were debating House Joint Resolution 5. So who knows who might be elected if, and they both talked about how difficult it is as young people just getting started really in their professional careers to take the time that it takes to be a great representative for their constituents. And they're on the opposite ends, as you know, of the political spectrum. But
You
who knows who's going to benefit from this? We know the constituents will benefit. We know that those who need this additional income to serve will be able to better afford to serve. And that's really what it's about.
You mentioned earlier the example, or you provided the example of a lawmaker who, who was asked by a constituent about their staff. There is a belief out there that lawmakers do receive a salary. So, how much of with November just right around the corner, how much of this will have to be an education campaign as well as a campaign to approve the ballot question?
I think they go together. I think we really need to educate the voters that this is different from the past proposals that have not been successful. And times have changed. When I go to town hall meetings and I listen to, as a guest, and I hear people talk about their issues, and you know what they are, from climate change to education to healthcare, public health, which is one of my areas. Um, they all care deeply about their issues. And when it's my turn to say, "Why are you here, Cliff?" I say, "These are all great issues, ladies and gentlemen. If you want a better chance of our legislature having the capacity to address these issues, please support modernizing the legislature in the various ways we've talked about."
Mr. Reese, I'm glad that you brought that up because we've talked about a paid legislature, a paid legislative staff, length of sessions. What are some of the other aspects of modernizing the legislature?
Right. As I've done this research, and I've used extensively, by the way, the wonderful research library that you may have also used on the fourth floor of the Roundhouse. It's
Yes.
part of the Legislative Council Service, one of three year-round committees. People may not know it's a public library. Anyone can go there obviously during office hours, and ask questions or get research done by their professional librarians on legislative issues. And I highly recommend it. And I've actually taken several of the new district legislative aides who have come from out of town up there and said, "You need to know about this because you may get a question back there in Las Cruces or Hobbs or Albuquerque. And here's a resource for you. It's not well known, highly recommended." Couple of things. And the good news about these are that they basically require appropriations. And as you know, we've got some money stashed away in the bank. It may be hard to get to.
Right.
Things that I want to see happen, and it can happen in January if the leadership includes it, in what we call House Bill 1. Call that the feed bill because it has the per diem. It pays the expenses of the legislature. It pays the staff expenses, pays for us to be able to buy food at the wonderful coffee shops there. We need to expand what's on the legislative website. Those of us, and it's the public, not just me as a professional, it is good, but it's limited in what it has on the website. If you watch, and we also, along with that, need to upgrade the quality of the webcasts, both in the committee rooms and on the floor of each house. By the way, we also need a small appropriation to allow senators to vote electronically. There are ways, the House does it. House members get 30 seconds when it's time to vote, and they push the red button or the green button. There's no reason why the Senate can't do that either. A lot of this is because that's the way we've always done it, tradition. And well, I love that song about tradition and Fiddler on the Roof. Traditions can also be modified as times change. Things have changed. We're not 1912, but a lot of the foundation for that still exists. We have, and COVID-19 played a big part, the pandemic, when we had to have virtual a virtual legislative session in 2021, and we went to virtual meetings and the public being able to speak virtually in committees. Great stuff, but it needs to be updated. And so that just requires an appropriation to do that. Some of the rules need to be changed. Rules around filibustering, for instance. A lot of time is spent that maybe could be better spent on the bills rather than on hearing the same questions over and over again. I won't mention any names. Uh, so,
Yes,
and
sure.
maybe a limit on the number of bills that legislators can be the prime sponsor on, for instance. We know legislators who run themselves ragged, literally
Mm.
exhausted, because they're very conscientious and they can't say no to people who ask them to sponsor bills. We need to be a little more careful, I think, about how we spend the time in committees and on the floor, and use things like consent calendars. Many of the bills are unopposed. They're just good government bills. They're maybe minor tweaks. We don't need to spend hours and hours and hours on those bills. Let's have consent calendars. We've done this in the past. This isn't new. This is just things that I've observed over the last 40 years or so that I've been going to the Roundhouse as an executive branch attorney and as legislative staff. And then there's policies like the district legislative aids. After the money was appropriated in 2024, I think was the first year, or 2025, we've now had 3 legislative cycles of funding them. We now have them adequately funded. We need to train them. We can use the website to train people better. And also the many, many seasonal staff, session staff like me who just work during the session. We all need to be trained unless we've spent a lot of time there like I have, but I'm still learning as well. So those are the kinds of things that can be done. They don't get a lot of attention. Things that we're talking about around salary and length of the session and what bills are germane, those are in the Constitution. Those require the voters. And then, of course, appropriations require a bill that passes both houses and a governor to sign. And to give the governor and past governors credit, most of them don't really, as I think out of respect for separation of powers, they usually give the legislators what they ask for, including the pensions, by the way. The governors could veto those pension requests, but for obvious reasons, governors usually don't, although I think it was Governor Richardson who pocket signed an expansion of a salary back in, I think it was 2005 or so. Um, but that's really in the weeds stuff that those of us that have become addicted, I think, to the process know about. Does that answer your question? There's a
Yes.
lot that can be done, and it's very doable, and it all comes down, in my mind, to the leadership. And when the leadership wants something, as you know, the leadership of both houses, they usually get it. And you've interviewed Senator Worth recently. He's done some great work as the Senate Majority Floor Leader. I think Speaker Javier Martinez on the House side has done some excellent work. They have both supported most of the things that I have talked about. Certainly, they supported the legislative salaries and made sure that that got through both houses and to us, the voters. And as Representative Tarajón said on the floor of the House, let's let the voters decide whether legislators have earned a part-time salary. We pay county commissioners. We pay city councilors. We pay just about everybody except boards and commission members. They get per diem and mileage, but they don't get a salary. I've served on several county boards here in Santa Fe, including the Independent Salary Commission that has recommended salary increases for county elected officials. I don't expect to get paid a salary for that, but if I needed it, per diem and mileage would be nice. It's time. It's time that we pay the legislators what they've earned, and I think what they've deserved.
Well, salaries for elected officials are always a touchy issue and one that always generates a lot of attention. Mr. Reese, am I missing to ask you anything on the subject or anything you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so. There's only 4 constitutional amendments on the November ballot. In the past, as I've looked at them, there have been up to 12 or 14 constitutional amendments. That's tough for people that don't follow it as closely as you and I do. There's
Mhm.
only 4 on this ballot. Please get acquainted with the issues. And I'm going to vote for all four, by the way. I'm a private citizen. I'm not speaking for any elected or appointed official or agency. My First Amendment rights have been restored. So I'm going to vote for all four. Others have to do with doing away with the pocket veto that the governor has, with changing how the student region is appointed, with changing the election process a little bit for school bond elections. That's our own Senator Linda Trujillo from Santa Fe has sponsored that. The legislature puts out, and next month in August, we're almost there, on their legislative website under publications, a publication called the pros and cons, or the for and against, for each of the constitutional amendments that will be on the ballot. And of course, the wonderful folks at the League of Women Voters do a voter guide. So if you can't get in touch with me, there are resources that are available to give you a little more information. And then, of course, the New Mexican and the other newspapers will be writing about it and hopefully endorsing them. I've read the endorsements, and it's a mixed bag. But I think now is the time. I think now is the time. We need to take those steps forward, and I think we have a good roadmap to do that. So that's why I'm spending my active retirement, part of it anyway, educating people about the issues from my perspective as having been there at the Roundhouse as you have.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your perspective and insight into this constitutional amendment. And thank you, as always, to our viewers and listeners for tuning into Around the Roundhouse. Join us every week as we talk to newsmakers in the political realm by subscribing through Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. For the latest developments, including our coverage of everything that's on the November ballot, from constitutional amendments to the race for governor, follow our coverage online at santafenewmexican.com, where you can also subscribe to our political newsletter, The Roundhouse Report. Until next time, I'm Daniel Chacón, and this has been Around the Roundhouse.